Zamek by Omar Cuellar. In the autumn of 1986, Edward, a 28-year-old man, was living a quiet life in Wilmington, Vermont, a small town where the whisper of wind through the trees seemed to carry the days away unhurriedly. He worked at a local bookstore, surrounded by shelves that smelled of old paper and ink, and lived in a modest apartment where the aroma of morning coffee blended with the scent of polished wood. To all outward appearances, Edward was an ordinary man, but inside him something strange was beginning to take shape. One night, while reading under the dim light of a lamp, a fleeting image flashed through his mind, the silhouette of a faceless man wrapped in a mist that seemed to vibrate with an unknown energy. Edward dismissed it as a product of his ever-active imagination, prone as it was to inventing stories. But the figure did not fade. It was the beginning of something that would change his life forever. As the days passed, the presence of this mysterious man grew more vivid. Edward saw him in his dreams, in the reflections of rain puddles, in the most ordinary moments, as though the figure were slipping through the cracks of his reality. The being was tall and thin, dressed in a suit that appeared to shimmer with a strange glow, as if woven from threads of another world. It had no clearly defined face, yet its mere presence filled Edward with an inexplicable dread. He tried to ignore it, to convince himself it was a passing fantasy, but the man appeared more and more often, as though claiming a permanent space inside his mind. Inwardly, Edward began referring to the entity simply as the man, for it had no name, yet he felt that this being knew him in an intimate, deeply unsettling way. Edward's life began to unravel under the weight of this obsession. He stopped seeing friends and no longer enjoyed walks in the park where autumn leaves crunched beneath his feet. Everything now seemed to revolve around the presence that lived inside his mind. It was as though his consciousness had become a refuge for this entity, a place where it grew and grew stronger. But the visions were not harmless. Whenever the man appeared in his imagination, the world around him descended into chaos. Cities burned, oceans rose in fury, hurricane-force winds swept everything away, and at the center of every catastrophe stood the man, motionless, absorbing the destruction with a calmness that chilled the blood. Edward would wake from these visions with his heart racing, wondering whether his mind was creating the images or whether the man was forcing them upon him. Fear took hold of Edward. What if this being wasn't merely a figment of his imagination? What if it was something real, something alive that was using his mind as a portal into existence? The thought tormented him day and night. He felt the man's presence expanding, its outlines becoming sharper, as though it were on the verge of materializing. He avoided mirrors, terrified he might see the figure standing beside his own reflection. At the bookstore, customers noticed his nervousness, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting the man to appear at any moment. His nights turned into a whirlwind of insomnia, broken only by dreams in which a sourceless voice spoke words in an unknown language, words that carried a power that made him tremble. A terrifying truth began to take shape in Edward's mind. He was the anchor keeping the man in this world. His life, his very existence, was what allowed the entity to keep growing inside his consciousness. If he did nothing, the man would break free, and the visions of destruction that haunted him would become reality. The images in his mind grew darker still. Armies clashing on devastated battlefields, skies torn apart by impossible lightning, and always, at the center, the man watching with a calmness that seemed to mock all of humanity. Edward came to believe he was responsible for those visions, that the man was causing them through him. If he didn't stop it, the world would pay the price. The only solution Edward could imagine was to end his own life. If he died, the man would die with him, trapped forever in the silence of his mind. The idea filled him with terror, but also with a strange resolve. He spent days wrestling with guilt, thinking of his family and the friends he had pushed away, but the visions of a ruined world were stronger. His life, he told himself, was not worth as much as all of humanity. On a cold autumn afternoon, as the sky turned gray and the air smelled of coming rain, Edward stood on the curb of a busy street in Wilmington. His hand shook, but his mind was made up. He saw a bus approaching, its engine roaring like an unstoppable beast. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he saw the man more clearly than ever, almost tangible, as though already crossing into the real world. With a scream that echoed only inside his own head, Edward ran into the street, straight into the path of the bus. The impact was instantaneous, a blinding flash of pain followed by absolute darkness. His body collapsed onto the asphalt, and life slipped away in a single breath. But in that final instant, something changed. Among the crowd gathering on the sidewalk, one figure stood out. A young man of about 28, with hair black as night and pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the fading light. He wore a strange suit, as though woven from materials not of this planet, and his eyes watched the scene with an unnerving calm. He was no ordinary bystander. He was the man, now real, set free by Edward's death. As Edward's life faded, the man spoke. His voice was clear and resonant, as though the universe itself vibrated through it. "My name is Zamek," he said, with a certainty that sliced through the air like a blade. "And this is how beings of my kind can take on life in this world." There was no malice in his words, only the cold statement of a purpose fulfilled. The crowd, absorbed in the tragedy, did not notice him. Zamek remained there, motionless, as though drinking in the moment. Edward's death had not been the end. It had been the beginning. He had been the bridge, the necessary sacrifice for Zamek to cross into reality. The town of Wilmington carried on with its rhythm, unaware of what had truly occurred. People spoke of the tragedy for days, but no one mentioned the man in the strange suit who had stood watching. No one saw Zamek walk away, melting into the city's shadows with steps that did not seem entirely human. No one knew that something had changed, that an alien presence now walked among them. In his desperation to save humanity, Edward had opened a door to something far greater, something he could never have comprehended. Somewhere in the void where souls fade, the echo of Edward lingers, trapped in the question of whether his sacrifice was in vain. Were the visions of destruction that tormented him memories of a future Zamek would bring? Or were they merely the delusions of a broken mind? Beneath the gray sky of 1986, in the streets of Wilmington, something new had begun to move, and the world unknowingly had taken a step toward an uncertain fate.